In November of 1950, during the Korean War, a young priest was trapped near Unsan, Korea, along with the wounded men he refused to leave behind. His name was Emil Kapaun, a Kansas farm kid turned army chaplain, and within hours the Chinese army had taken him prisoner. That part of his story, a lot of people already know. What happened after his capture inside a frozen prison camp with almost nothing left to give is the part that actually defied everything. It's a story about a stolen potato, a secret mass, and a 70-year mystery that a stranger's waiting room appointment finally solved. Hello, I am Father Felix, and this is an inspiring story about a young priest named Emil Kapaun, who grew up on a small farm outside Pilsen, Kansas, in a Czech Catholic family. They worked the land the way most families in that stretch of the country did, without much extra and without much complaint. With a dry sense of humor, he used to joke later in life that he tried for low grades in school on purpose, just so nobody would ever put him in charge of anything. That plan didn't hold. He would become a priest, ordained in 1940, and in 1944, near the tail end of World War II, he joined the Army Chaplain Corps instead of settling into a small, quiet parish on plains of Kansas. His first posting sent him to Burma and India. He rode a jeep for what felt like 1,000 miles some days, just to reach a handful of soldiers who needed a priest more than anything else. After the war ended, he was released from active duty in 1946. After obtaining his master's degree in 1948, Father Kapan, with the blessing of his bishop, returned to active duty and was soon bound for Japan. Then, in the summer of 1950, North Korea invaded the South, and by that July, Father Kapan's division had landed on the peninsula to help push the invasion back. It didn't take long for the men around him to figure out what kind of chaplain they had. He set up an altar on the hood of his jeep and celebrated Mass wherever the unit happened to stop. He sought out the wounded instead of waiting for them to find him. One soldier who served beside him put it simply: to the men in that unit, he was just Father, and whenever trouble came, they drew their courage straight from him. Someone once asked why he ran toward gunfire instead of staying safe. His answer stayed short. Where you hear the shelling, he explained, somebody is wounded, somebody is dying, and they need him. That covered the whole explanation. No performance sat behind it, no need to dress it up, just a plain statement of fact from a man who'd already decided what his job was. By the fall of 1950, that answer faced a test that nobody around him, including Kapan himself, could have fully prepared for. On November 1st of 1950, near the town of Unsan, the war changed shape overnight. As Chinese forces poured across the line in numbers nobody expected, something close to 20,000 men against roughly 600 Americans in Kapan's battalion. Most of the division fell back, but Kapan's unit couldn't. They were cut off, surrounded, and running out of options fast. When the order came down for every able-bodied man to evacuate, Father Kapan didn't go. He stayed with the wounded on purpose, fully aware of what staying meant. He spent the fighting running from man to man across open ground, sometimes 100 yards past the American line, to drag the injured back to safety. By the time it was over, he had personally pulled close to 40 men out of places they wouldn't have walked out of on their own. The math on that battalion turned brutal. Of the roughly 800 men who had arrived at Unsan, 600 were killed or captured before it was over. Most of the 200 who made it out either escaped on their own or were saved because the young priest talked the Chinese into letting them go. Even that wasn't the end of it. As Chinese soldiers closed in, Father Kapan found a wounded Chinese officer among the casualties and talked him into arranging a safe surrender for the Americans still trapped in the pocket. It's the kind of negotiation that shouldn't have worked, and somehow it did. Then came the moment that would later anchor his Medal of Honor citation. Chinese soldier stood over a badly wounded American named Sergeant Herbert Miller, rifle raised, ready to finish what the battle hadn't. And Kapan crossed the road to stop him. He shoved the soldier out of the way and picked Miller up himself. Miller recalled later that he braced for the gunshot and it never came. The soldier just stood there with a look of pure shock on his face, as if he couldn't quite believe that this man wasn't afraid to die. Father Kapan fell into Chinese hands that day, along with the men he refused to abandon. What almost nobody talks about is what came next. POW Camp in North Korea in the dead of winter became its own kind of battlefield, and this one had no negotiating with wounded officers to fall back on. The camp at Pyoktong sat through the coldest winter on record, with temperatures dropping to -20 and -30 degrees. Frostbite was common, so was dysentery, so was pneumonia, and prisoners survived on little more than cracked corn and millet, which is birdseed, while their bodies withered down until they looked like skeletons. On the worst days, as many as 24 men died in that camp alone, and the younger prisoners were often the ones who lost hope the fastest. Father Kapan responded to all of it with the only tools he had, which turned out to be farm tools. He woke before dawn to melt snow into clean drinking water for the men. He hammered scrap metal into basins so the sick and wounded could be washed properly, since nobody else in the camp was ever going to do it for them. At night, he slipped past the guards to steal food, usually potatoes, whatever the camp had lying around. He never kept any for himself. Getting caught meant a beating or worse, but he kept going out anyway, night after night, because men were dying at a rate that made the risk feel beside the point. He'd find a man, put a hand on his shoulder, and ask if he'd eaten anything that day, if he'd had water. Somewhere in that exchange, a quiet prayer and a blessing from the priest almost always found its way in too. Some nights it amounted to nothing more than a rosary passed hand to hand in the dark, and even that was enough to keep something alive in men who had every reason to let it go. In the spring of 1951, even though it was forbidden and could have gotten him killed, Father Kapan led an Easter Mass for the men. He kept telling them to hold on to who they were and what they believed in, no matter what the camp tried to take away from them. One survivor remembered it plainly afterward. "Father saved our lives," he added, "really saved them, because he kept morale up and told everyone not to give up hope." The Chinese noticed. A camp full of starving, freezing men grew much harder to break when this one priest kept refusing to let them lose their faith or their nerve. He had become the thing holding the camp spirit together, and that recognition, as it turned out, would soon cost him his life. The death house and a buried secret. That same spring, Father Kapan's own body had started failing him. Months of starvation and cold turned into pneumonia, and pneumonia turned into a blood clot the camp couldn't treat. The Chinese guards did what they always did with dying prisoners. They shipped him off to the camp's so-called hospital, a place that existed mainly to remove dying men from the rest of the camp before they died. He told a fellow prisoner not to cry over him. He explained he was finally going where he'd always wanted to go, and that once he arrived, he'd say a prayer for every one of them. On May 23rd, 1951, at just 35 years old, Father Emil Kapaun died in that death house. No funeral took place, no marked grave existed, only a Chinese guard ordering 3 American prisoners, including a man named William Hansen, to bury the body before anyone noticed. They had no shovels. They dug with sticks, and their bare hands reached down about 1.5 feet, laid him in the ground, and covered him the best they could with dirt and loose rocks. Then they whispered a quiet prayer and walked away with no way to mark the spot and no reason to think anyone would ever find it again. That's where the story stopped, and it stayed that way for almost 70 years. When the war ended, both sides agreed to exchange the remains they held, which numbered close to 1,900 Americans in total, but almost none of them could be identified at the time. The army listed Kapan's remains as non-recoverable in 1956. An unidentified body, believed at the time to be one of thousands lost somewhere in that war, rested among the unknowns at a military cemetery in Honolulu. Everyone who knew him assumed he'd been lost to one of the camp's mass graves, along with so many others who never came home. This is where the story takes an interesting turn. Decades later, in a VA waiting room in Florida, an aging William Hansen picked up a copy of Columbia magazine published by the Knights of Columbus and saw a photograph that stopped him cold. The article covered a Korean War priest being considered for sainthood. Hansen recognized the face immediately because he'd been the one who buried that man with his own hands. He told his doctor, right there in the office, that he'd buried the priest in that article himself. That conversation set off a string of events that led all the way to the Pentagon. Hansen's account of the camp's layout and the location of the death house lined up with the physical evidence closely enough that investigators started to believe him. In 2019, DNA testing confirmed it. Height, age, dental records, and a mitochondrial DNA match all pointed to one conclusion. The unidentified remains resting in Hawaii belonged to Emil Kapaun. On September 29th, 2021, his own hometown diocese of Wichita, Kansas, laid him to rest in the ground he'd grown up on, nearly 70 years after his death in that frozen camp. Recognition seems to be ongoing for the young priest. In 2013, President Obama posthumously awarded him the Medal of Honor for what he did at Unsan, and a Catholic high school in Wichita has carried his name since 1956. In addition to the Medal of Honor, his awards include Legion of Merit, Bronze Star Medal, and a Purple Heart. But medals only tell part of the story. The Catholic Church had been asking its own questions about him since long before his remains ever turned up. It named him a servant of God back in 1993. And in 2025, the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints in Rome moved him a formal step closer to canonization by declaring him venerable. The same man who ran through gunfire to save strangers also gave away his last potato and prayed over the dying, with no medal waiting for either one. That never split into two different kinds of brave, It stayed the same choice, repeated over and over, right up to the end. His cause for sainthood is still moving through Rome one hearing at a time. Perhaps the next time we are asked to make a small sacrifice, we can think of the courage Father Kapan exhibited in all his sacrifices, both large and small, knowing that there is infinite power in his divine grace. If you find this kind of courage inspiring, there are more stories like it waiting here every week. God bless, and I am Father Felix.